What's your number? Well, that is a question that we hear from time to time. But every time you hear it, somebody is asking you personal information. Someone's asking you something about yourself that you may not want to reveal. For instance, if you're a lady, and a guy comes up and says, "Hey, what's your number?" You know exactly what he wants and probably what his intentions are. If you go to the doctor's office, they'll say, "What's your number?" He's probably talking about your cholesterol number or how much you weigh. If you go to the gym and say, "Hey, what's your number?" they're asking how much you can bench press or what's your body fat index or how much you weigh. But here's a number that I think will make you uncomfortable. Did you know that earlier this week, the Social Security Administration came out with their annual report? And they came out with what I would call bad news and worse news. The bad news is that the report came out and said that the Social Security Fund will be out of money in 2033. In just 21 years, there will not be enough money in the account to pay for their expenditures. The worst news is that last year's report said that year was going to be 2036. So in 12 months' time, we're 3 years closer to the Social Security Fund being out of money. And that, it should make you uncomfortable. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters and guests, there is a financial company out there that actually uses this phrase, "What's your number?" And I think it's a good start for us. I did borrow it from them. What they're talking about is what number, what amount of money do you need when you start your retirement? And we're going to talk about that tonight. And so I do want you to think about your number. And I'm going to ask you what your number is, actually what about 5 numbers are. And I'm going to ask you to write those down. So anybody who does not have a pen, would you please raise your hand? Sergeant at Arms has pens for you. Anybody need a pen? There's one behind you. And for paper, you can turn over your agendas because there's enough room on the bottom of the back of the agenda for your notes. And on the left-hand side of that, in the margin, if you please write down the 5 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're going to look at 5 numbers very quickly tonight. And I want you to think about this as you plan for retirement. The very first number, I want you to put down how many years you have until retirement. Not what age. Not what age. If you're 40 and you're going to retire at 60, don't put down 60, put down 20 years. You're going to retire in 20 years. You're going to retire in 10 years. You're going to retire in 5 years. If you're already retired, just take the information down and share it with somebody who's still working. That's number 1. Number 2 is, how much money will you need to live on in retirement? Now, this is kind of a subjective number. So you're going to have to think about whether you're going to have your house paid off, whether the kids are going to be gone, whether you're going to downsize. And so you're going to have to pick a number. Let's say, for sake of illustration, that your number is $50,000. You're going to say, okay, in my case, I've got 20 years to work. I want to have $50,000 in income in today's dollars. And then when I retire in 20 years, we're going to have to adjust that for inflation, are we not? So that $50,000 over 10 years, the factor is 1.27. So if you're going to retire in 10 years, you're going to have to add to that number and multiply that number times 1.27. If it's 20 years, it's 1.65. If it's 30 years, it's 2.37. So in my case, 20 years, $50,000 is going to be $82,000 is what I'm going to have to prepare for. So that is your gross number that you're going to need for retirement. You can subtract from that what you think your pensions are going to be. If you have a pension, if you're fortunate enough to have a pension, great, subtract that number from it. You can probably also subtract some Social Security number from it. In my case, I did adjust it. Social Security, in my case, would be about $3,000 a month. I'm assuming it's going to be reduced by about 1/3. You're going to see this coming up. It's going to happen. It'll be another speech of mine. But I assume that out of my $82,000, I can subtract $24,000 for Social Security. So that means I'm going to have to come up with $58,000. That's my number 2. My number 2 is $58,000. That's what I'm going to have to fund out of my savings. The third number is how much do I need to save in a lump sum to generate $58,000. Let's call it $60,000 for sake of ease. $60,000 when I retire. So I'm going to need to assume a distribution rate. So out of that sum of money, I'm going to have to pull out some money. And I'm going to assume a distribution rate of 6%. Now, for those of you who have done financial planning and you looked at your own plan, 6% is very rich But I'm telling you right now, I'm not planning on leaving anything for my kids, all right? So 6%. So I'm going to need $1 million. It's very easy math. $1 million at 6% will give me $60,000 a year. That plus Social Security and the small pension will probably fund what I think my expenses are going to be. That's number 3, that sum of money. The fourth number is how do I gather $1 million in 20 years if I haven't saved already? Now, if you have saved some money already, that's a little more complex calculation, but let's assume that you haven't saved any money and you have 20 years to save $1 million. Well, now the question is, how much can you earn on your investment? You have to use your compound interest tables, and I'll throw out a couple of numbers. If we assume a return rate of 8%, which is also fairly rich, but if we assume a return rate of 8%, the compound interest table on annual contributions for 10 years is 16. For 20 years, it's 55. For 30 years, it's 122. So for me, if I need $1 million, I divide it by my 20-year number of 55. It tells me I need to save about $20,000 a year to have $1 million after 20 years. $20,000 a year, which means I save $400,000. The other $600,000 comes from earnings. All 4 of those numbers are not the most important number. The most important number is number 5. The question is, how much are you saving? How much are you really saving? And here's my point. Most of you, I know, might have access to a 401k, and they encourage you to save 5, 10, 20, 15%. They may match it. So some of you think if I'm saving 10%, that's good. And I'm here to tell you that 10% of your earnings is not enough to fund your retirement. It's not enough to fund your retirement. You're going to need to be saving about 15% to 20% because we have to make up for lower returns and the lack of government subsidies. Now, I say all this not to discourage you. I want to encourage you. So when you get home tonight, talk to your spouse, your significant other, do your own calculations, find your own number, and make sure that you're saving enough for retirement. Mr. Toastmaster.